Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Goedele Liekens. I'm a Goodwill Ambassador for UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund, and I've been asked to be your moderator for this panel. The panel discussion, I hope, finishing and moving beyond the health MDGs. Now, as you all know, we only have 2 years until the deadline of the MDGs. So not only do we need to accelerate the efforts to achieve the MDGs, particularly the most off-track ones, like child mortality, maternal health, there are many challenges still, but we urgently need to focus on the post-2015 development agenda. Over the coming year, the preparation of this post-2015 development agenda will be shaped through different channels and partners. And we here in this panel, and you in the audience, I hope we will help. Because this panel will focus on the access to healthcare for all in this agenda. We'll debate on how we will build on and improve the health MDGs after 2015. We will discuss priority strategies to address the barriers of universal or to universal access to health. And therefore, we will have 2 thematic debate rounds. The first one will be on how to ensure an outcome-focused health goal to address the equity and human rights shortage of the MDGs. As you all know, there's a shortage in these topics. And the second thematic round will be how to ensure sustainable financing for health and country ownership. That is what our panel will be about today. I'll proudly introduce to you our panelists. I'll step aside. Okay. Next to me here, sitting, Dr. Marleen Temmerman, Director for Reproductive Health and Research of WHO, the World Health Organization. Next to her, Majata Mbodj, Member of the Parliament of Senegal. Third place, Joël Gustave Nana. He's the Executive Director of the African Men for Sexual Health Rights, the MSHR, as they say. Next chair, Charles Goerens. He's a member of the European Parliament for Luxembourg. There we have Anne-Marie Descote. I say it right, Descote. Descote. She's the Director General of the Department of Globalization, Development and Partnerships for France. And the last chair, Veronique Lorenzo, Head of Unit Health and Education for the European Commission. Welcome, everybody. Now, before we're going to start the panel, I'd like to invite on stage Reverend McDonald Sembereka. He's a special advisor to Joyce Banda, the President of the Republic of Malawi, and he will speak on her behalf. Welcome.
Good afternoon. I'll read the speech as it was presented on behalf of my president, who was unable and is not happy that she was not able to come and be with you due to pressing national engagements. She couldn't be available here. However, she sends greetings to all of you. It would have been a pleasure for her to come back to the European Development Days this year. She's normally honored to have the opportunity to share with you some of the lessons learned from the perspective of her home country, Malawi, and her international engagements, including as one of the 3 co-chairs of the UNAIDS and Lancet Commission on Defeating AIDS, Advancing Global Health. The 2012 report on MDG progress in Africa indicates that Malawi has achieved impressive progress on the MDGs, notably in the areas such as reducing child and infant mortality, maternal mortality and malnutrition, developing gender parity in education, and addressing AIDS, malaria, and TB. As member states gathered in New York to articulate the future development agenda over the coming year. The message is, let us not forget the Secretary General's vision to eradicate malaria and achieve a future free of AIDS and tuberculosis, as expressed in his recent report, A Life of Dignity for All. Reducing the burden of these diseases will not be sufficient in a post-2015 world. We must aim for a zero. Health must be prominently positioned in the post-2015 agenda with bold and ambitious goals and targets. The health-related MDGs and similar expressions of national and global leadership and commitments have played a decisive role in this progress. We cannot be timid and shy in formulating the post-2015 health agenda. Health and education underpin social development and economic growth. A sustainable future cannot be achieved with a model of economic growth which leaves behind the poor and marginalized and does not ensure basic living standards for women and children. The tide to turning against the world's deadliest and most infectious disease, HIV, tuberculosis, diseases, HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. In Malawi, the number of AIDS-related deaths has plummeted from 86,000 in 2001 to 46,000 today. An estimated 76% of those in need now receive antiretroviral treatment. Such tremendous progress must continue. As we confront new challenges, we must build on progress made to further advance global health in the post-2015 agenda. We must put people first and transform global health. We need to move from disease-specific approaches to people-centered health. Given the remarkable progress we have made in scaling up access to antiretroviral treatment, it would be a tragedy now to allow people to die from other preventable diseases. TB is the top killer disease among people living with HIV. I am proud to report that Malawi is now in the lead among high-burden TB/HIV countries in ensuring access to treatment for both diseases for people who are co-infected. Millions of women in malaria endemic areas in Africa become pregnant every year. Malaria continues to be a threat to these women and their babies, with up to 200,000 newborn deaths each year as a result of malaria. Today, we have the tools to stop this. We have improved our ability to save the lives of these women and children. We need to do much better in tackling the significant public health challenges now posed by non-communicable diseases in Africa. Services for HIV and other communicable diseases must be fully integrated with non-communicable diseases and general outpatient care. In Malawi, we are, with the support of the European Union, UNFPA, and UNAIDS, making progress in better linking sexual and reproductive health and rights with HIV at all levels. Service geared towards service program and policy with immediate benefits. Malawi is among the countries which have successfully integrated the promotion of HIV testing in community campaigns which provide screening or prevention services for multiple diseases. We need to reconnect health systems and community systems and develop a new agenda for primary health care. To do this, we must move from high-cost health services provided by doctors and hospitals to a sustainable, efficient models provided by empowered communities and non-traditional care teams. In Malawi, the uptake of self-testing for HIV more than doubled when it was accompanied by assisted home initiation of antiretroviral therapy. Malawi is successfully pioneering NESE's administration of antiretroviral therapy and integration of community health workers in various HIV services, including administration of HIV treatment by specialized community health workers. We must endeavor to democratize global health and make smart investments in ensuring gender equality, equity, and human rights. These are three imperatives that must not be divorced. With my background in human rights, I'm a passionate advocate for global health approaches based on evidence, human rights, and gender equality. Greater meaningful involvement of people living with HIV is a critical element to our progress and has led to the way towards a democratization of global health towards accountability systems led by citizens. It is right and also smart to invest and focus our resources where they are most needed and will have the biggest impact on the poor and marginalized, women and children. Gender inequality and violence against women are significant barriers for global health and must be addressed. In Malawi, the introduction of cash transfers for schoolgirls was found to reduce HIV infection by 60%. Malawi was among the first African countries to introduce free ARVs for all in need. Malawi is the only country that has implemented a policy where all HIV-positive pregnant women start treatment for the rest of their life. This policy is known as Option B+. This provides an important step to achieve in Malawi the Secretary General's vision of a future free of AIDS. Alone we can do so little. Together we can do so much. Shared responsibility and global solidarity can transform global health. Malawi has not made progress on its own. We are mindful of so many players who have helped us to get to where we are. The principles of shared responsibility and global solidarity, as outlined in the African Union Roadmap for the response to AIDS, TB, and malaria, are critical to our success. We are grateful for the global solidarity expressed through multilateral and bilateral support from the Global Fund, European donors, and PEPFAR. This does not mean that we leave our destiny in the hands of others. No, we take responsibility as a country. For Malawi is in the driving seat, and we align the international funding our country receives with our national health priorities, our planning and budget cycle, and the development of our health system. We have shifted mindset from traditional donor-recipient relationships towards country-led and sustainable approaches based on partnership and co-investment. This approach must become the norm moving forward, not just for addressing these three diseases, but for changing the way we do development and global health. With domestic health spending reaching 18.6% of our national budget in 2011, Malawi has surpassed the commitments made at the Abuja Summit, and we are eagerly pursuing ways to further reduce our dependency. We are mainstreaming HIV financing and have required government entities to utilize at least 2% of their budgets to HIV activities. We are exploring innovative financing options. According to projections, more levies on the surpluses of telecommunication firms or calls can generate almost $8 million for HIV financing per year in Malawi. We are doing our utmost. We cannot close our response gap without external assistance. Our own resources are sufficient to cover only 30% of the resource gap for our national response. This year, the Global Fund announced an appeal to governments and private sector donors for 15 billion replenishment for the next 3 years. While this appeal represents a substantial financial commitment during these times of economic austerity, it is also presents a significant opportunity to completely control these diseases once and for all. As called for by the UNAIDS and Lancet Commission, let us work ambitiously together towards defeating AIDS and advancing global health now in the post-2015 era. I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Sembereka. No, I'm not one to sit. I'll have to stand for a while. Thank you very much. Now, what I haven't told you yet is that this panel is a joint initiative between Action for Global Health, Countdown 2015 Europe, the Federal Public Service for Foreign Affairs of Belgium, UNAIDS, Save the Children, UNFPA, WHO, and the World Bank. Now, as you all probably know, these are very modern and up-to-date organizations. So we had planned on having a poll, a very modern, up-to-date poll, where we combined something with social media and your tablets and iPhones and all these things. We have 4 questions we'd like you to answer to. But how this technically works, it's too difficult for me. I don't understand any of it. I'm a bit an IT Neanderthaler, I always say. So I have a charming assistant. Where is he? Ans? Ans, where is Ans? Ans, can you explain how this technically will work? Because people have to take their mobiles, iPads, computers. Come on stage. Charming assistant, I said. Okay, how will this work?
So actually, Ornella, can you launch the... Good. So welcome to everybody first. Actually, it's much more easier than it looks like. All you need for this interactivity is already in your pocket. Actually, you can use different devices, your smartphone, your iPad, tablet, or even your even Twitter. You can even vote by using Twitter. So it's very simple.
And where do they serve to then?
Actually,
we have internet to start with.
Yeah. Okay. How to ask? Wow. So, we wanted to make this meeting as much interactive as possible. That's why you can use your devices to send codes or to vote, or even voting for the different codes that have been sent by all the audience. So you can interact even between you participants of the audience. So let's move to the first page. Second. Okay. Oh, yellow.
It doesn't seem to be that simple. You're trying to convince me it's simple, but...
Yeah.
But for the questions, where do people go if they want to answer? We have 4 questions foreseen, which are multiple choice. One day we'll have them on the screen. You see here, where you have multiple choice, and at the end we would like to talk and discuss a bit the results, what the audience thinks. So how do people get to these questions?
Yes, let's go back to the yellow page. Actually, it shouldn't be yellow. I'm sorry for that. So the other one, previous? Yeah, this one. So what is... May I? Okay. What is written here is at the right, you have the phone number, which is a French one, 06 0033 6 33 13 40 34. What do you send at this phone number? You create a new message. A simple step. You create a new message. Then you tap the keyword. The keyword for this event at this auditorium is EDD 13A, because we are in auditorium A. EDD for European Development Days 13A. Can we go back, please? Yes, thanks. And at the left, you have the our link. in order to join the our meeting, and the questions. You can see these polls, the live questions that will be proposed to you in a few minutes at this link. So you go to app.ysambly.com/EDD13A. The same, EDD13A is for European Development Days, 13 at the Auditorium A. What you will find at this link, you'll find these live questions. Okay, now you're gonna say, how can I answer the question? It's good to go to this link, but how can I answer this question? Actually, you have 3 propositions, answer A, answer B, answer C for the first question. All you need to do is to send EDD13A, then space, and then you put 1, 2, or 3 for the first, second, or third proposition. If you wanna answer A, for example, for answer A, you send EDD13A space 1. If I want to answer C, you press EDD13A space 3. C for 3. Is it okay? Okay. This is the solution if you're using SMS votes. If you go into this link, you use the app, and it's much more easier on your device. All you need to do is to select your answer. You'll find all the answers, and you just have to choose one. You can also use Twitter. I don't know if you can see it. Hashtag EDD13Health, relative to the thematic of this session. And also vote by using Twitter. Or you can even send a mail, but I think it's much more easier to use Twitter or SMS. Okay. Hope it was...
Yeah, you act like you do like this as if it's really simple. You make us feel stupid, but I'm sure the audience is much more intelligent. And now they have one more thing?
Yeah, can you just do a test? Actually, just send something and let us see if you really notice that it works. Just send something, hello, hi, or something. Thanks.
Okay, or comment on his explanation. Thank you very much, Hans. Whoa, am I lucky that I just can stand here and talk and read from a pen and a paper. And we might start the first session then, just old-fashioned. But please continue with your social media, because we'd like to know the answers to the questions we have there, and we'd like to discuss them at the end of the session. So please, try to. Okay, the first session, how to ensure an outcome-focused health goal that addresses the equity and human rights shortages of the MDGs. Marleen Temmerman for WHO. For your organization, WHO, the universal health coverage, UHC, they say, is the overarching health goal. How do you think UHC could deliver on sensitive and controversial areas as sexual and reproductive health?
Thank you, Gudle, for the question, and good afternoon, all of you. Let me start by saying that first and foremost, WHO remains fully committed to accelerating the work towards the MDGs, the unfinished agenda, because we are indeed approaching 2015, but that doesn't mean that we're just changing gears. We still have to work hard, and we have to take some of the aspects of the MDGs into the post-MDG agenda. As far as the universal health coverage is concerned, it requires, what is universal health coverage? I think there is a lot of misconception, but it requires that all services of good quality are available for all without financial constraints or financial barriers. That doesn't mean that everyone, the high quality is important, but not one country can afford to cover all services for all people. So we will have to carefully reflect on what do people really need to meet their health needs. Mm-hmm. And there are 3 points that are very important. For whom are these services? What is the quality of it? And how much will they cost? So that is a discussion that has to be carried universally, but also, of course, depending on what in your area, what the major global burden of disease, what are actually the most important health aspects in your own region. So it will be kind of covering, in the first place, health for all at the primary healthcare level, but also then taking into account, of course, the burden of disease. So UHC includes coverage across the major causes of ill health, and includes not only, because a lot of people think it's about insurance, it's about coverage, and it's about treatment. It's not only treatment, it also includes, of course, prevention, promotion, rehabilitation, and palliative services. So it's more than just the treatment. But to reach that, we also need, of course, technology, we need medication, so it's a global approach. And the vision of UHC embodies principles of equities and right to health. Now, I think personally that in this agenda and also in the next agenda, we have to invest more in explaining what it means, the right to health. Because in some countries or in some regions, people think it's a kind of a hidden agenda to include the LGBTs or to include right to abortion. But the right to health means actually that somebody is accountable. And let me maybe explain this, because we haven't invested a lot in explaining what it means. We have invested a lot in what are MDGs. But the right to health, if I talk to, I'm an obstetrician gynecologist myself, I've worked in many parts of the world. If I talk to my colleagues in the health sector, they say, well, what are you talking about, the right to health? We are public health, we do our very best, and still women are dying, like in lots of African settings. We do for whatever we can, and we make a little bit of difference. But if you work from the concept of the right to health, that means that somebody is accountable. A country, a government that is not doing that has a very high maternal mortality rate, which is in my view one of the strongest indicators to measure the value that a country gives to health. But if you have a very high maternal mortality rate and you don't really do something, you don't act as a government, then I think your people have the right to address the government and say, we have the right to lower maternal mortality, we have the right not to die when we are pregnant, and so on. So the rights means that somebody, and that is in that case the government or the global world, is accountable to it. Universal health coverage is a key issue to socioeconomic development, of course, and by definition, UHC would have to deliver on all health issues related to the continuum of care, which includes reproductive, maternal, not only, but includes also the aspects of reproductive, maternal, newborn child, and adolescent health. The leading cause of maternal mortality, and I come back to the area that I know best, are preventable causes of maternal death. Women die because of unwanted and unplanned pregnancies, because they don't have access to contraceptive services, they don't have access to family planning, and that's why MDG 5 is moving slower than the other MDGs, because it has something to do with the right of women to have access to family planning, the right of women to decide when they want to get pregnant, when they want to have sex. So it is a rights of women issue. It's a lot to do with women's empowerment. And we have to make sure that also in the post-2015 that we take forward the unfinished MDG agenda, but also that we look at where do we have to do better. And again, maternal mortality, women die of preventable causes. They die of high blood pressure, hemorrhage, infections, lack of aseptic abortion. So all with goodwill, political goodwill and investment, all these causes can be actually prevented and treated very easily. So I think whatever we take, we from WHO, of course, we go with the universal health coverage as the main weapon for the post-2015 agenda, but very much from an equity and a rights perspective, and also focusing on all people, but in the first place on girls and women, because they are lagging behind. And I think we have to invest more in girls and women, because women, they are not only half of the world, they also make the other half. And they deserve our equity and respect. Women are half of the world, but they also make the other half. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. It's obvious that this is your topic. No, but Majetta Mbodj, your country, Senegal, launched last year some kind of basic UHC program. Could you briefly highlight its main components, and could you tell us how this makes progress in the health MDGs?
Merci beaucoup, thank you. Je voulais d'abord vous dire déjà que l'évolution du système de santé au Sénégal n'a pas toujours favorisé l'équité dans l'accès aux soins, mais également dans la protection financière des ménages et également l'équité dans le financement de la santé. Et que l'architecture actuelle du système de santé n'offre la couverture du risque maladie qu'une petite partie de la population, c'est-à-dire 20% de la population. Et cette population est tout simplement limitée à ceux qui appartiennent au secteur public, dont leurs parents travaillent dans le secteur public ou dans le secteur privé. Cette situation n'offre pas une large couverture des risques maladies de la population. Et l'année dernière, après les élections, le nouveau gouvernement du Sénégal a adopté pour la couverture maladie universelle. Et qu'est-ce que cette couverture maladie universelle vise? La couverture maladie universelle vise à contribuer drastiquement à l'atteinte des 3 OMD de la santé, c'est-à-dire les OMD 4, 5 et 6. Qu'est-ce qu'on entend faire au niveau de cette couverture? Déjà, au niveau de la couverture maladie universelle, le gouvernement du Sénégal compte passer de 20% à 50% en 2015, c'est-à-dire augmenter la couverture risque maladie de 20 à 50%. Maintenant, pour pouvoir le faire à travers la couverture maladie universelle, le gouvernement du Sénégal a opté autour de 3 piliers qui sont fondamentaux. Le premier pilier, c'est quoi? C'est une réforme pour la gratuité des soins. La gratuité des soins, en créant un fonds national de solidarité pour la santé, pour que les césariennes soient gratuites, mais également les soins pour les enfants de 0 à 5 ans soient gratuits. Et quand on parle de soins pour les enfants, c'est tous les soins relatifs aux infections chez les enfants de 0 à 5 ans. Aussi bien les frais d'hospitalisation, les frais de vaccination et les frais d'hospitalisation. Et ceci, nous sommes présentement à un taux de mortalité de 76 pour 1000. Nous pensons qu'en appliquant la gratuité chez les enfants de 0 à 5 ans, nous allons atteindre 46 décès pour 1000, de réduire de 72% de 72 pour 1000 à 46 pour 1000. Donc là, c'est le premier pilier. Le second pilier, je le disais tout à l'heure, au Sénégal, l'offre de couverture des risques est très limitée. C'est 3/4 des 20% des populations qui travaillent pour le secteur public ou le secteur privé. Donc, le gouvernement a entrepris des réformes pour augmenter la cotisation dans les institutions de prévoyance maladie, c'est-à-dire les IPM. Donc, on va augmenter la cotisation et élargir la couverture. Parce que vous conviendrez avec moi que le pourcentage de couverture est très faible. Et donc, pour assurer une large couverture, il faudrait qu'on augmente les cotisations, mais également qu'on élargisse la couverture. Ça, c'est le deuxième pilier. Le troisième pilier, le gouvernement a pensé que, avec le premier et le deuxième, on ne va pas toucher les populations pauvres des villages et on ne va pas aussi toucher les gens qui sont du secteur informel. C'est pourquoi le troisième pilier vient pour compléter les deux premiers piliers. Et ce troisième pilier, c'est vraiment la création de mutuelles de santé au niveau communautaire. Il y a un programme qu'on dit le programme DECAM, c'est le développement d'assurance maladie au niveau communautaire. Et en ce moment-là, le gouvernement est prêt à mobiliser des frais additionnels pour prendre une partie qui va être couverte par le gouvernement, mais l'autre partie, ils ont démarré ce qu'on appelle la bourse familiale pour les familles pauvres, et une partie de cette bourse familiale va permettre à la famille de cotiser pour la couverture maladie communautaire. Donc, il y en a trois piliers. Le premier, c'est pour la gratuité des soins. Le second, c'est les institutions de prévoyance maladie qu'il faut élargir et augmenter le financement. Le troisième, c'est donc les mutuelles de santé au niveau communautaire pour couvrir les pauvres, mais également pour couvrir le secteur informel. Maintenant, le grand défi qu'on connaît maintenant est que toute la population qui était considérée comme faisant partie des groupes vulnérables, tels que les personnes vivant avec le VIH, les orphelins et enfants vulnérables, les usagers de drogue, les hommes qui ont d'autres relations, les hommes qui ont des relations sexuelles avec des hommes, les professionnels du sexe ne sont pas du tout considérés par ces différents groupes. Et pourtant, il y avait un acquis. Dans les programmes de lutte contre le sida, toutes ces personnes-là bénéficiaient d'un traitement qui est gratuit. Et donc, le grand défi, c'est comment élargir la couverture maladie universelle à ces groupes que je viens de citer. Au niveau du Parlement, où je suis membre du comité de santé, on est en train de mener un travail de plaidoyer sur deux fronts. Le premier front, c'est on va se battre pour que le budget de la santé soit augmenté. Parce que jusqu'à présent, le budget de la santé du Sénégal n'a pas atteint les 10% du budget. Alors que le Sénégal avait ratifié l'ensemble des conventions de la réunion d'Aboucha, mais également de la feuille de route de l'Union africaine. Donc, au niveau du Parlement, on est en train de faire du plaidoyer pour l'augmentation du budget de la santé. Mais également, on est en train de travailler avec nos autres collègues pour que les populations vulnérables soient intégrées dans la couverture maladie universelle pour au moins assurer les acquis qu'ils avaient. L'autre chose qu'on est en train de faire, on sait que la société civile est très influente et très organisée au niveau du Sénégal. On est en train de les rencontrer pour créer une plateforme très forte de la société civile pour que la société civile puisse s'approprier de la couverture médicale universelle. On voudrait que dans le paquet du renforcement de ce qu'on appelle le renforcement du système communautaire, qu'on puisse y intégrer la couverture maladie universelle, parce qu'on sait que le troisième volet, qui est la création de mutuelles de santé au niveau communautaire, ne pourrait être réussi que lorsque la société civile s'approprie de la stratégie, lorsque la société civile accepte de porter la stratégie au niveau communautaire. Donc, en plus de notre rôle de parlementaire, on est en train de travailler avec les acteurs de la société civile pour, une bonne appropriation de la couverture maladie universelle par les acteurs de la société civile, mais également l'implication et la prise en charge globale des personnes vivant avec le VIH, des MSM, des travailleurs du sexe, des usagers de drogue et des orphelins dans le cadre de la couverture universelle, dans le cadre de la couverture maladie universelle. Merci.
Yes, thank you. We'll move to Joël Nana, Director of the African Men for Sexual Health and Rights, AmSure. Yes, you promote the health of one of the most marginalized communities. From your perspective, what are the most important barriers for groups such as LGBT and young people to access to the health services they need?
Thank you so much. It's refreshing to sit on a panel and hear a parliamentarian talk about men who have sex with men without any fear. Thank you, Maguette. In terms of the barriers that LGBT people face in Africa, there are a number of them, and there are a number of those that prevent them from accessing services. Before even talking about access to services, we should perhaps start thinking about availability of these services. Those services, for the large number of them, are not available in the first place for a number of reasons. There is lack of knowledge in terms of the specific needs of these communities. When they are available, the quality is not adequate in the places where people can access them, in the ways that people could access them in places that are free of stigma and discrimination. And when they are available, they are in a very small quantity, meaning in a small part of the city, of major cities in the countries. And usually in other parts of the country, these services are not available. So that is the first step. Those services are not available in the first place in order for them to be accessible. But before even thinking about availability of these services, perhaps research, we should already start thinking about research to make these services available. We have seen across the continent, we have seen ethics committees preventing research on these communities, because in places people think that researching these communities will provide impetus for advocacy for the recognition of these communities. Therefore, they are not even researched in the first place. And the lack of visibility of the data that is available. And even when the data is available, sometimes there is a problem of how to put that data out in order to allow for services to be delivered, to be made available and delivered to these communities. There have been places where data was made available, and the data was used in ways that it actually put LGBT people at risk, rather than ensuring that they access these services. And of course, the big old question, the frameworks. I think one of the major challenges that we have seen on the continent has been the legal and policy framework around sexual orientation and gender identity, but usually mainly around sexual practices. Across the continent, 39 out of 54 countries still sustain laws or some form of law that criminalize consensual same-sex activity between people of the same sex. Although this is usually for targeting men, we have seen situations where women have been arrested. Actually, there's a current case in Senegal of 5 women who were just recently arrested on those charges. And in a situation like that, it makes it difficult for services to be made available for these communities, and even for these people who self-identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or trans, to go and access services, because the mere fact that you do say that you are a gay man puts you at risk of being arrested rather than receiving the services that you went for in the first place. But the most important part of these laws actually is not even the fact that they exist, although their mere existence is a challenge. It is the enforcement of these laws. While we know that usually the law the law usually says that a person who has sex with a person of the same sex, meaning that there has to be material proof that somebody has had sex with somebody of the same sex in the past, in less than 3 years in most cases. But usually people are just arrested on mere allegations that there is a gay man living up there, and people get rounded up and thrown in jail. And we have seen services collapse where people get arrested. When there have been small local CSO that have started to make these services available for these communities, once communities start feeling threatened, these services collapse.
Can I ask you a question? How do
Yes.
you see then solutions for more equality in the post-2015 agenda?
In terms of solutions, that is a hard one. There is a growing movement on the continent. I think in almost every single country on the continent, there is some kind of organizing around the protection of the rights of LGBT people. And usually it is young, self-identifying gay, lesbian, bisexual, and trans people coming together and organizing themselves to start addressing the issues faced by these communities. But even beyond just these communities, we have seen parliamentarians such as Magatte champion the issues of these communities in places that are where the mere discussion around these issues is difficult. We have seen religious leaders such as Pastor Sembereka, I mean, a number of examples in this room, champion these examples in the countries where they live. And presidents such as Joyce Banda herself, putting a moratorium to prevent people from being arrested. There are numerous examples across the continent. But the most inspiring example of this all is these young 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old men, women, and gender non-conforming people standing up and demanding their rights. I think that is the part, and taking the highest of risk. We have seen places where activists get killed for the mere reason that they stand up and speak up. And people are very knowledgeable of these risks, but yet they stand up and speak up on these issues. Mm-hmm. So there is a movement, there is the beginning of a movement. 5 years ago, an organization such as the one that I'm running right now didn't exist on the continent. But here we are. We have a continental organization working to support communities at country level and at community level to address their own issues. And we have a voice, and it is a voice that is ever growing and ever strengthening with allies that we have across the continent.
For change, you need courageous people. That's obvious. Thank you very much. Well, we move first on to Charles Goerens. Oh, Marlene, you want to add something? Whoa, yeah, well spoken. One of the courageous persons. We move on to Charles Goerens. Mr. Goerens, as a member of European Parliament, you were actively involved in shaping EU's position in the post-2015 development agenda. What is your assessment of the UN special event on the MDG outcome document when it comes to health and especially equity?
Oui, merci. J'ai lu le document 2 fois. Et à la première lecture, je me suis dit, c'est un document qui contient un certain nombre de banalités, comme c'est le cas dans la plupart des documents à caractère international où on cherche le consensus. Un certain nombre de rappels, notamment les objectifs de Monterrey, de Doha. Et si on les rappelle, c'est parce qu'ils n'ont pas été remplis. Alors je me suis dit, en relisant le document une deuxième fois, est-ce qu'on veut vraiment aller jusqu'au bout? Est-ce qu'on veut réaliser dans le domaine de la santé tout ce qui est techniquement possible? Parce que si on veut réaliser tout ce qui est techniquement possible, on peut trouver une réponse non partielle, mais une réponse globale à toute la problématique. Il y a des domaines politiques où on va jusqu'au bout. Je prends par exemple le domaine du renseignement. Dans le domaine du renseignement, on arrive à écouter ce que dit la chancelière en privé ou à ses ministres. Donc là, on va jusqu'au bout. C'est parce qu'on veut aller jusqu'au bout. Moi, je voudrais qu'on en fasse de même dans le domaine de la lutte contre la pauvreté, où si on n'est pas prêt à aller jusqu'au bout, qu'on remplisse au moins les objectifs auxquels on a souscrit. Et ces objectifs sont les 0,7% pour tous nos pays. Il y a des objectifs quantitatifs. Donc voilà un objectif quantitatif. Il y a des objectifs quantitatifs, des sous-objectifs quantitatifs, réserver un certain pourcentage des sommes allouées à l'aide publique au développement, à la lutte contre les maladies, contre le sida notamment. Là, on a quand même des expériences et des expertises qui valent d'être reconduites. Et puis, il y a les objectifs qualitatifs. Je crois que les experts qui sont ici à à cette tribune sont mieux à même de répondre sur ce point. Mais ce que je voudrais dire avant tout, c'est qu'à la relecture du document, il y a un point qui me paraît tout à fait essentiel, c'est le principe de la responsabilité commune et différenciée. De mon point de vue, si on veut aller jusqu'au bout, il va falloir décliner ce que cela veut dire. Et le monde en 2013 n'est plus le monde de 2001 ou de 2002. Le monde de 2013 est le monde marqué encore davantage par la globalisation, par un fossé qui se creuse non pas entre les nations, mais à l'intérieur des nations. C'est là où les inégalités croissent et c'est donc là qu'il faut mettre l'accent. C'est là qu'il faut activer le levier. Donc les responsabilités, qui est responsable pour cela? Les pays en développement en premier lieu parce que c'est leur responsabilité de faire les choix. C'est à eux de dire ce qu'ils attendent de leurs partenaires. Les pays donateurs, bien entendu, j'ai dit, ils ont failli à leur objectif de financement, notamment de 0,7% pour ce qui est de l'Union européenne. C'est une honte, ça a été rappelé maintes fois, mais qui plus est, les plus pauvres et les gens les plus menacés, si on parle d'objectifs quantitatifs, se trouvent dans les pays émergents. Et là, il y a des richesses qui se créent, et ces richesses ne sont pas allouées à des fins, notamment de lutte contre la pauvreté, notamment contre les désavantagés. Donc il y a le document auquel vous faites référence est une bonne base de discussion, mais il va falloir devenir plus concret. Et moi, j'aimerais que, après avoir entendu ce qu'ont dit celles et ceux qui m'ont précédé, que l'Union européenne fasse preuve d'une très grande détermination pour ce qui est de l'assomption des responsabilités et qu'elle se mette aussi à cet auditoire large une ambition très forte. Et moi, je demanderais, par exemple, à l'Union européenne, dans son nouveau programme panafricain, qu'elle va devoir négocier avec l'Union africaine, la sécurité sociale complète pour tous. Ça doit être l'objectif. Ce n'est pas une mince affaire. Il y aura 1 milliard d'euros à la disposition de l'Union européenne, mais je crois qu'avec ce milliard, on pourra proposer des solutions à tous les pays, à commencer par les plus pauvres d'abord, et ensuite à proposer une assistance technique à ceux qui disposent déjà de ressources suffisantes pour subvenir à leurs propres besoins. J'ai dit que ce n'est pas une mince affaire pour la simple raison que, et Madame vient de le rappeler, au Sénégal notamment, pour que tout le monde ait accès à une couverture sociale, une couverture de la sécurité sociale, il faudrait sortir donc toutes ces personnes qui vivent dans l'économie informelle. Et ça, c'est le grand défi. Donc le défi dépasse de loin la santé, mais il faut avoir des vues claires, un objectif ambitieux, et je le répète, il faut aller jusqu'au bout dans ce domaine.
Wow, you're an ambitious man. Thank you very much. I hope your colleagues in the European Parliament agree with you, or as courageous as you are. Anne-Marie Descartes, according to the French vision, UHC, as we have been talked before, implies that all people have access to necessary health services without any discrimination. Now, we heard from the former speakers that there are many barriers for this across the world. How do you respond to their concern?
Merci tout d'abord d'aborder cette question qui est vraiment au cœur des enjeux du développement, et je compléterai des propos qui ont été tenus notamment par les deux premières oratrices. En effet, il y a, je pense qu'on peut déjà acter un certain succès dans la mobilisation autour des OMD de la santé, mais effectivement, comme vous l'avez dit, il y a encore des barrières à franchir. Alors, quelles sont-elles et comment faire? D'abord, la première barrière, elle est économique. En effet, on a constaté qu'une des principales lacunes des objectifs du millénaire pour le développement, ça a été le manque d'attention aux problèmes d'équité et d'équité dans l'accès au système de santé. Cela a été dit, 100 millions de personnes basculent chaque année dans la pauvreté et du fait du problème des paiements directs de la santé. Des centaines de millions d'autres renoncent à se soigner et ce sont des problèmes extrêmement graves. Cette privation de soins et d'accès aux soins, elle est condamnable au plan moral, c'est une chose, mais c'est surtout inefficace au plan macroéconomique. Et c'est sur ce point que je veux insister, parce que finalement, on constate que des travailleurs en mauvaise santé sont in fine peu productifs, et il y a ainsi un cercle vicieux entre pauvreté et mauvaise santé qui ne fait que s'aggraver, alors qu'on constate que dans les pays où la couverture sociale est généreuse, eh bien, la productivité par habitant est meilleure. Nous pouvons, en ce qui nous concerne, le constater, et nous pensons qu'en prouvant cet objectif de couverture sanitaire universelle, il y a un vrai changement de paradigme en faveur d'une approche plus durable du développement. La deuxième barrière, c'est celle des systèmes de santé eux-mêmes. Nous le savons, cela a été rappelé tout à l'heure, l'offre de santé est souvent segmentée, inégale, de mauvaise qualité. Les établissements de santé sont répartis de façon inégale sur les territoires. Les médicaments essentiels font parfois défaut. Les personnels ne sont pas toujours qualifiés. Or, si les objectifs du millénaire en matière de santé ont permis de progresser, eh bien, ils l'ont fait en faveur de priorités verticales, c'est-à-dire par maladie ou par population spécifique. Et nous pensons qu'on a certainement négligé une approche horizontale par les systèmes de santé. Or, ces deux aspects sont absolument complémentaires. Alors, la France ne peut pas critiquer l'approche qui a été suivie jusque-là, puisque nous sommes nous-mêmes d'importants donateurs dans le système de la santé. Premier donateur au fonds United, deuxième au fonds mondial. Nous sommes également très fortement contributeurs au Gavi. Mais nous voyons bien qu'il y a un problème de qualité opérationnelle des services de santé. Et donc, en promouvant l'objectif de couverture universelle, nous pensons que nous pouvons rendre également plus efficace l'aide qui est organisée aujourd'hui de manière verticale, et donc réconcilier ces deux cibles, verticale et horizontale, et donc au total permettre une meilleure efficacité des fonds qui sont alloués par les instruments que j'ai cités. La troisième barrière, c'est celle des discriminations. Et là, nous pensons vraiment que la France et l'Union européenne se doivent de porter le combat des droits de l'homme sur le terrain très concret de l'accès aux services de santé essentiels. Il y a des textes, depuis longtemps, nous le savons. La Constitution de l'OMS dès 1948 garantissait le droit de jouir d'un meilleur état de santé. Le pacte international relatif aux droits économiques et sociaux et culturels de 1966 l'a réaffirmé. Mais aujourd'hui, ça n'est pas le cas partout. Il faudrait parler aussi de la santé sexuelle et reproductive qui a été évoquée tout à l'heure. Et il faut vraiment aujourd'hui que l'agenda du Caire de 1994 soit effectivement porté dans l'agenda post-2015, et je ne parle pas de ce qui concerne aussi les droits de l'enfant. Donc voilà, nous voyons bien qu'il y a ici des progrès à faire. Nous étions assez satisfait de l'adoption il y a un an par l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies d'une résolution, la résolution A6781, au nom du groupe Diplomatie et Santé, qui a permis, je crois, de briser un tabou en faveur de l'accès aux services de santé des segments les plus vulnérables et les plus marginalisés de la population. Mais il faut maintenant aller plus loin et prendre des initiatives sur le terrain. Nous pensons que l'Union européenne a un modèle social à défendre dans la mondialisation. C'est le moment de le faire. Et en voulant promouvoir cette couverture sanitaire universelle, nous ne voulons pas imposer un modèle et sûrement pas un modèle de financement. Ce n'est pas du tout le sujet. Il s'agit de partager une ambition commune, une manière d'approcher ce sujet, comme je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, pour réconcilier l'approche verticale avec une approche horizontale qui s'occupe du système de santé, c'est-à-dire vraiment de la base, de l'infrastructure. Et je crois que c'est vraiment aujourd'hui tout à fait nécessaire si nous voulons franchir un pas supplémentaire en matière de santé.
Thank you. Veronique Lorenzo, the EU has declared on several occasions, even on paper, that's why I can read it here, they have declared a strong commitment to reduce health inequalities and to progress towards universal health services in partner countries. Now, how does the EU live up to this commitment? And what is their priority for health in the post-2015 agenda?
Thank you very much. Perhaps just to say a word on the post-2015 before I go on to how we live up to our commitments. Certainly, the unfinished business of the health MDGs remains very much a concern and remains very much a priority, in particular the slow progress on maternal health and universal access to reproductive health and rights. Now, in terms of how we live up to our commitments, the EU, let me give you, first of all, the framework, and some of the speakers have spoken to that before. Our global health policy relies very much on a rights approach, okay? Now, what is it that we want, and what is it that we want to live up to? Ultimately, we want to ensure access to healthcare. What does access mean? And it means in our vocabulary, increasingly, it means equitable access. It means access to quality services. And eventually, and this is our ambition, but it's a long road, it means access to universal health coverage. Now, our policy framework looking forward is the umbrella policy we have is the Agenda for Change. And the Agenda for Change changes our approach by making us focus on the poorest, neediest countries, the low, what we call LICs, the lower income countries, which means that we will, our approach changes, we will have less countries and a higher level of investments in each of these countries to make up. So it's very much a needs-oriented approach. Now, as Joël very well mentioned just before me, the problem, you know, while we want to provide access and to make possible for people to finance access to health services, the most basic problem and what takes precedence is the supply of services, the availability of services, as well mentioned by Joël. And we are working in countries where this supply is not ensured at all. The services in many cases don't exist. So first and foremost, our approach is to focus on building or on supporting the build-up of health systems. Now, the health systems have all kinds of different elements, which at the higher level is the stewardship and governance of the sectors, but it goes into very, very practical things, such as the availability of sufficient numbers of qualified health workers to be deployed in places where they are needed, and that's usually remote and rural places. And of course, with the supply, the other big pillar is the supply of affordable and quality medicines. And of course, there are the pillars ensuring adequate financing of the sector and providing the financial risk protection for the users. So this is very much, I mean, I fully agree that there's a complementary, so there's supply, and we also need to ensure that the demand, the users get access. But in the first instance, we are focusing on supply because we are focusing on the poorest countries. Okay. Now, to address a little in a slightly different way the question of vertical and horizontal approaches, I would very much say that we, again, going back to we live up to our promises by focusing very much on the country. This is the core of our investment. It's the core of our strategy, and it is where 80% of our resources and our effort goes. It's at country level. If you can visualize our support, it's in concentric circles, and the core of it, the heart of it, is the country level. And we do that by strengthening country systems, aligning, supporting the development of national health policies, and aligning all our support behind them.
Okay.
Complementary to, just to finish up, complementary to that is the approach, the support we give to the Global Fund, to the global initiatives, the Global Fund, Gavi, in areas where a global approach has a comparative advantage and brings additional value. And finally, perhaps, we don't go, providing for healthy lives goes, of course, much beyond the sector, and we do have a policy of promoting health in all our other policies. Perhaps we all know it requires a holistic approach, including health prevention and promotion, that's been mentioned before. I would just give one example, which is the current effort we have cross-sectorally to work on nutrition, where we partner with our colleagues from food security to understand the different dimensions of nutrition and hence address them simultaneously and more effectively. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I interrupt you a few times. But we need to speed up a bit, I've been told. So you're all such good speakers. But before I go to the second session, Madeleine Temmerman, you wanted to add just a little thing?
Just very briefly, because several members of the panel mentioned the criteria for universal health coverage. This is a document that was published last month by WHO, which has a title, Universal Health Coverage, Supporting Country Needs. And that is actually based on the principles of availability, accessibility, affordability, adaptability, acceptability, quality, and equity, with a focus on reaching the populations that can be discriminated against for reason of gender, geographic location, culture, or socioeconomic status. So there's a kind of new document that could help to feed the discussions.
Yes, for the framework. Thank you very much. Now, we'll have to move to session 2. This is about the financing, to ensure sustainable financing for health and country ownership. We'll talk about the roles of national governments, of the donors, of the civil society. And some of the speakers already have mentioned a bit about this financing and so we might be able to go faster now. I'm going to start with you, Charles Goerens, because I understand you have to leave the panel, unfortunately. Now, EU is the biggest ODA donor. What role do you think EU should play in financing health?
Je voudrais d'abord dire que l'Union européenne, en tant que premier donateur, donc la Commission plus l'aide publique au développement des 28 États membres, doit être exemplaire. Elle doit donc être exemplaire de plusieurs points de vue. D'abord, elle doit avoir une approche cohérente, c'est-à-dire ne pas intervenir dans un domaine où d'autres pourraient faire mieux. Ça compte à la fois pour la Commission comme pour les États membres. Deuxièmement, l'Union européenne, en tant que telle, devrait jouer la carte régionale. Un exemple, dans la région sahélienne, vous avez une carte sanitaire qui a été établie notamment par le Club du Sahel et de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, que j'ai eu le privilège de présider pendant un certain temps. Alors là, vous voyez qu'il n'y a pas lieu de financer l'obstétrique dans un hôpital et de financer la même obstétrique dans un hôpital qui est 50 km plus loin. Faisons l'inventaire des besoins et jouons la carte de la complémentarité. Là, il y a une vocation au niveau de l'Union européenne à rencontrer des partenaires qui ont cette taille régionale et à discuter avec eux de ces problèmes. Je crois qu'elle le fait, donc c'est à l'Union européenne de faire cela. Deuxièmement, je dirais ce qu'elle ne devrait pas faire pour être exemplaire. Ce qu'elle ne devrait pas faire, c'est aller construire un hôpital quelque part et puis négocier avec l'État récipiendaire des droits d'exploitation de richesses minières en retour. Donc pour être exemplaire, d'abord, elle ne le fait pas. Deuxièmement, elle ne devrait pas le faire. Et troisièmement, elle devrait dissuader d'autres qui pratiquent cela quotidiennement à renoncer à cette pratique. Troisièmement, dernier point, je crois que l'Union européenne devrait aussi se concentrer sur des méthodes. J'ai dit tout à l'heure, assistance technique dans les pays qui n'ont peut-être pas le niveau scientifique, négocier des espaces d'action où des acteurs non étatiques aussi peuvent intervenir. Hein. Il y a des endroits où l'action de l'État n'est peut-être pas souhaitée, pas voulue, peut-être pas possible. Et là, il y a d'autres acteurs, notamment la société civile, soit dans les pays en développement, soit chez nous, qui pourraient donc combler cette inaction ou cette action qui n'est pas tout simplement pas possible. De ce point de vue, l'Union européenne a des enseignements extrêmement utiles à partager, donc pas d'être liée, réfléchir sur la méthode, être innovative au niveau des méthodes. Et un dernier exemple pour illustrer ce caractère d'innovation, je crois qu'un grand problème dans nos pays partenaires, c'est l'absence, ou l'insuffisance, voire l'absence de personnel médical et paramédical. Il faut y penser, il faut que quelqu'un réfléchisse à cette question. Comment combler ce besoin? Et là, je prônerais le financement de bourses d'études dont pourraient bénéficier les étudiants des pays qui ont vocation à devenir médecins ou entrer dans le système paramédical, à charge de nos budgets de la coopération au développement, et attendre de ces personnes en retour qu'elles fassent profiter, au moins pour un temps limité, leur pays d'origine de leurs connaissances acquises. Et leur accorder aussi des visas à entrée multiples afin de pouvoir mettre à niveau leur niveau de connaissance. Ce sont des détails pratiques. Je sais qu'il y a des choses plus spécifiques à dire dans le domaine de la santé. Moi, je suis généraliste, pas médecin, généraliste politique. Je voulais me borner à ces quelques conseils et je vous remercie aussi de votre compréhension de me rendre ma liberté maintenant parce que j'ai une autre réunion à Luxembourg à 6h30 et avec la circulation quand même un peu compliquée aujourd'hui, je dois devoir vous fausser compagnie. Merci de votre compréhension.
Merci, Monsieur Geurens. Are you going to leave us right now in the middle of the session, or are you going to stay with us a little longer? As you wish. Because if not, we say goodbye with a kiss, huh? No, you have to leave, really? Okay, thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you. Okay, for the other panelists, I really have to emphasize we have to make our answers a little briefer, because if not, there will not be time for questions from the audience. The good news is, well, it's not good news, but still, the poll did not work due to no internet. So I'm not the only IT Neanderthaler here. No, but maybe if we find the time, we can try to give some answers to those 4 questions we had. But we'll move now on to session number 2. Marleen, what are the recommendations for WHO regarding financing for health, especially on sexual and reproductive health?
Well, in those times when ODAs may be going down, first of all, we have to defend and to fight for ODA to go up. But anyway, we have to be realistic and make sure that the spending is very efficient, transparent, and targeted. Now, we did, at WHO, we led an initiative together with development partners, civil society, governments, what we call the investment framework on RNMCH, reproductive, maternal, neonatal, child health. This was a quite long, intensive exercise. We modeled, we calculated the return on investment. And that publication, that results have been published in The Lancet last week. And just, I'm not going to read all the results, that would take too long, but just maybe some major findings that the investment framework shows that with an increased investment of $5, let's say €4 per capita per year until 2035 in the 74 countries with the highest burden of maternal mortality, child mortality, we can achieve a 9-fold social and economic return in addition to millions of lives saved. And this means that it's possible to avoid the death of 147 million children, 32 million stillbirths, and 5 million women by 2035. So this is a serious investment. It's a 2% increase of ODA in this area, but it's possible. Important also is that additional investments in family planning can contribute to 53% of the estimated reduction in child death and 47% in maternal death because of fewer unwanted pregnancies, fewer abortions, fewer maternal deaths. So it is absolutely possible if we invest in RNMCH to have a very strong return on investment. And I want to kind of strengthen the investment in family planning and contraceptives by quoting a famous Indian professor, politician, philosopher, Karan Singh, who said in 1972 in Bucharest, economic development will lead to contraceptives. If women, if the economy is going improving, and then automatically women will have the choice and will take contraceptives, limit their families. 20 years later, in 1994, Karan Singh said, contraceptives and family planning will lead to economic development. So I think it's not one or the other, it's a circle, and it's one of the cases where the investment is very strong. This is one of the aspects of healthcare, but a strong one for women and children.
And that's language some people will understand. Thank you very much. Ms. Mbodj, your country, Senegal, is quite a good pupil in concerning health. They have increased their financing, they're taking stronger ownership. Of course, you have a lot of challenges, as you said yourself. But how do you see the role of the governments, and where's the role there for donors and CSO?
Thank you very much. Je crois qu'on l'a un peu abordé tout à l'heure. Le Sénégal a de très bonnes ambitions, a une bonne vision par rapport à la santé. Mais souvent, ne respecte pas ses engagements vis-à-vis des objectifs de la santé. Pourquoi? Quand on les aborde avec le gouvernement, il y a d'autres priorités qu'ils mettent sur la table. C'est l'accès à l'eau, l'accès à l'éducation, la réduction de la pauvreté, les inondations. Ce qui font qu'il y a un problème de santé, mais également il y a d'autres défis qui se posent devant eux. Et ce qui fait que ça fait beaucoup plus de déclarations, d'engagement que de réalité de terrain. Et nous pensons que par rapport à ça, la société civile peut jouer un rôle fondamental pour les aider. La société civile doit jouer son rôle de watchdog pour l'action gouvernementale. Il faudrait que la société civile puisse être forte et jouer son rôle de watchdog, mais également puisse être de la planification à l'évaluation de l'action gouvernementale. Mais pour ce faire, la société civile doit être renforcée, la société civile doit être appuyée. Les donateurs, les partenaires bi- et multilatéraux ont un rôle à jouer. Parce que ce qui s'est passé avec l'aide publique au développement, à un certain moment, on a demandé aux pays de choisir leurs priorités. Et ce n'est pas souvent la santé qui est la priorité d'un pays. Mais je crois que l'aide publique au développement doit être conditionnalité avec une implication réelle et effective de la société civile, avec des contreparties que les États versent systématiquement lorsque le pays ou le donateur appuie des infrastructures. Il faut que la condition soit, à condition que le gouvernement apporte un pourcentage bien défini de budget pour la santé, il faut que également l'aide que les donateurs donnent soit accompagnée par des résultats d'impact en matière de santé. Mais tant que la société civile n'est pas bien encadrée et on ne lui donne pas son rôle au niveau des pays pour lui permettre de jouer son rôle de watchdog, pour lui permettre de planifier et d'évaluer en même temps que les acteurs gouvernementaux, tant que les donateurs n'ont pas imposé des conditionnalités comme le versement des contreparties, mais également des indicateurs de santé qu'on puisse les mettre à contribution lorsqu'on reçoit un financement, il serait difficile de pouvoir pousser nos États à respecter leur engagement.
Yes.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Mbodj. Thank you. I really need to move on because I want to hear Mr. Nana's idea about ensure that the civil society and the communities that they can contribute. You've been talking about this. What's your idea about this? Because they always say country ownership must not just mean that it's government ownership.
Well, Margaret has almost already answered the question I was asked. I mean, the idea of country ownership is amazing. It's a good thing. We want to create a system where a country owns their various issues, and all stakeholders come together and act in a way to respond to the issue. But unfortunately, it's not always the case. Unfortunately, there are a number of parameters that should be defined and to ensure that country ownership effectively work. And currently, the way civil society sees it is that country ownership is indeed government ownership, because the way country ownership is perceived now is giving government more responsibility than government does have now, and continue to stifle the voice of civil society and the action of civil society, reducing civil society in most places into service providers, whereas civil society is not supposed to be service providers. Governments are supposed to be service providers. Civil society should be the watchdog, the policing, and to ensure that processes are democratic, to ensure that good governance takes place, and to ensure that people's rights are protected. But in an environment where government decides what policies to put in place, and often policies that do not allow for certain civil society, especially civil society working on specific and difficult issues, from even being registered to be able to exercise their legitimate process, which is advocacy, I do not see how country ownership will allow for that process to take place. It will be difficult for civil society, especially civil society organizations working on LGBT issues and sexual and reproductive health and rights issues more broadly, to even register and to work on those issues at country level beyond just providing services.
Yep. Okay, that's clear. Anne-Marie de Scott, you like, because I saw you writing a lot, and you like to add something to this, or are you going to talk about France? Because they say they promote an inclusive global partnership. How could this take form in the health sector?
Merci. Je crois que des choses très importantes ont déjà été dites, et donc je vais simplement revenir sur quelques points. Je pense que sur cette question du financement, qui est évidemment essentielle, et l'idée d'un financement durable, parce qu'on est là sur quelque chose qui doit s'inscrire dans la durée. On est aussi dans une situation économique très contrainte pour tous. Donc je crois qu'il faut vraiment qu'il y ait d'abord, et Madame Mbodj l'a dit très bien, une mobilisation des ressources nationales, parce qu'il y a un phénomène indispensable d'appropriation par les gouvernements, et ça je crois que c'est quelque chose qu'ils ont bien compris. Mais nous savons aussi, et Madame Mbodj l'a dit, qu'il y a tellement de priorités qu'il est difficile de choisir. Ce que nous pouvons dire avec certitude, c'est qu'en investissant dans la santé, c'est un investissement utile et qui a des répercussions dans d'autres domaines. En ce qui concerne les pays donateurs, eh bien, ils doivent bien sûr tenir les engagements qui ont été pris et peut-être pour aller plus loin et parce que les circonstances sont aujourd'hui plus compliquées, eh bien, il faut chercher du côté des financements innovants. C'est un domaine où la France a beaucoup travaillé puisque nous avons mis en place dès 2006 une contribution de solidarité sur les billets d'avion. Nous avons pu déjà collecter plus d'1,2 milliard d'euros qui ont été affectés à United, au Fonds mondial, à l'Alliance Gavi. Et nous sommes très fiers d'être le premier pays à avoir mis en place une taxe sur les transactions financières dont les premières ressources ont été allouées très récemment à un programme de développement en matière de santé pour le Mali. Donc nous espérons vraiment dans ce domaine trouver d'autres modèles de financement innovant. Il n'y en a pas qu'un, il n'y en a pas que deux. Il y a d'autres modèles qui peuvent être trouvés avec les pays dans lesquels ils s'appliquent. Il n'y a pas un modèle qui doit s'appliquer à tous, mais il faut trouver des solutions adaptées et en tout cas avec l'objectif de pérenniser l'aide dans ce domaine parce que, et je pense que c'est pour moi la conclusion, la couverture sociale universelle, c'est un objectif universel et adaptable et il n'est pas détachable du reste de la problématique du développement. Merci.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Briefly, Veronique Lorenzo, how does the EU promote sustainable financing for health?
Thank you. I could feel that you wanted to cut me out, but you
No,
didn't.
no, I wouldn't dare.
Try.
I wouldn't dare.
I'll try to give a quick answer. In a nutshell, I think what I'd like to say is what I'd like to be able to say in most cases is that the EU financing is aligned and harmonized. Now, aligned with country policies and harmonized with other donors. And this is particularly important in countries where we intervene because they are the poorest, because they are the weakest institutions, and in countries with scarce human resources and financial resources, we can do a lot of harm. So the biggest principle for donors is really do no harm, don't create. We have a huge scope to create distortions, and we need to be extremely careful and aligned with and agree. We have a number of set principles. They're called the IHP Plus, International Health Partnership Principles. The rules exist. We need to play by them. I guess that's the first message. The second message is that sustainable financing actually means that ultimately who bears the institutional and financial responsibility is the host, is the beneficiary country. There's no shortcut to it, there's no short-circuiting it. And that we have, I think, going forward, also because of the constraints on resources, there's a renewed focus on domestic resource mobilization, so that all the funds, and this has been said before, all the funds we come with complement rather than substitute the essential core that are domestic resources. Thank you.
Okay, we move on to questions now. Are there any questions from the audience? Microphone all together. Now, you seldom have a chance to ask your question to an squeezed panel like this, huh? So this is the time to participate. Oh, but two here. Okay. Please mention your name, organization, and to whom you would address your question.
Hello. My name is Esther Ashet, and I'm Nigerian. My question goes to the EU, and by the EU, I mean the EU Commission, the EU Parliament, as well as the Council of States. In the new budget cycle of the EU, in the new focus of list of priorities, particularly as regards the geographic and thematic instruments, health as a priority theme is not listed. So I would like to know, and also to hear from members of the EU to be sure that the issues surrounding health, and most especially sexual and reproductive health needs of young people, young women, and also women in general, would not be lost in the entire process of the next funding cycle, 2014 to 2020. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Goerens has left. He saw this question coming, maybe, but I'm sure you can answer this also, Ms. Lorenzo.
Okay, thanks very much. You're right, it's not listed, but there is, I think, the way we guarantee our commitment, there is a commitment to allocate 20% of our entire ODA resources to human development. And human development very clearly includes health, education, social protection, and employment. And that's how we foresee, and we very much hope and expect that similar levels, we have a flat budget, but similar levels of investment in health will be maintained for the next cycle.
Okay, thank you. Second question, sir.
Thank you. My name is Ken Bluestein. I work for Age International, which is part of the Help Age International Global Network. I wanted just to respond a little bit to something that I was hearing regarding the necessary to allocate resources and the fact that perhaps under universal access to health and the right to health, that not every group will have access to the same resources. And this concerns me, frankly. It concerns me because in terms of the huge transition that's taking place in terms of the demographic transitions happening in many countries worldwide, by 2050, it's estimated there will be 2 billion people over the age of 60. Currently, we know that in terms of non-communicable diseases, NCDs, 70%, about three quarters of the people who are dying from NCDs are over the age of 60. And fundamentally, if we are talking about the right to health, at what age do we cease to become human? At what point do we stop allowing people to be treated according to their physical needs as opposed to an arbitrary age? We have high expectations of what can be achieved from post-2015, and we think this mantra of leave no one behind really drives the heart of what can come next. And this panel is a great example of really putting universal health care first and foremost. But sexual reproductive health and rights do not stop when one gets older. Also recognizing the role of older people in making sure that people within the community, within their own households, have access to all of these very basic things we're talking about. So is there an equitable solution for making sure genuinely that there is going to be access to health that is appropriate for people of all ages and abilities? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any of the panelists feel a very huge need to make one sentence for us to take away after this panel, because we really have to close. The next panel is going to start. So, no, all spoken. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. I may make a short conclusion that I've written down. I'm to start with very pleased that European Development Days offer this opportunity to discuss the place of health in the post-2015 development agenda. I think we all agree that health is a critical contributor to development and human well-being. So we should build on and improve the health MDGs, that's for sure. We had a very fruitful exchange here on this topic with excellent speakers. What I take away from today's discussion is, first, that the road ahead is still long and difficult, and there's no space for complacency. There are still too many challenges ahead. But secondly, we have now the unique opportunity to ensure that we leave no one behind. It's a unique opportunity. We can achieve better health outcomes for all. Every challenge is an opportunity. A major progress has been achieved over the past decade, particularly during the last 5 years. Let's not forget that. For instance, children are significantly less likely to die of diseases or malnutrition. Global HIV infections continue to decline, and access to antiretroviral drugs has expanded. But, however, we have a lot of work ahead. Many challenges to ensure the right to health still remains. Women, for instance, they continue to be the subject of discrimination. We've heard that throughout the panel several times. And very painful for me as a UNFPA Goodwill Ambassador, they are confronted with severe health risks, in particular to maternal health and their sexual and reproductive health and rights. 7 million people living with HIV still do not have access to treatment. And in too many countries, the rights of marginalized groups, including LGBT people, are violated. We heard that from you. Now, to address this in the new framework, we need to develop priority strategies for universal access to health by addressing the shortage of the MDGs around equity, human rights, financing, and ownership. And maybe I should finish with one word. Mr. from Malawi said, together we can do a lot, huh? So thank you very much. I get thousands of signals to stop, so the rest for next year. Thank you, panelists. Thank you.